Then, several years later, and after Lincoln's death, 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were proposed in rapid succession and sent to the states for ratification. Here are those 3 amendments, which could be considered as the foundation for equal rights in America. The 13th Amendment, proposed in January 1865. The 14th Amendment, proposed in June 1866. The 15th Amendment, proposed in February 1869. That was 3 amendments in 4 years, yet it took another 40 years until the next amendment was proposed. Once an amendment is proposed and clears both the House of Representatives and the Senate by a 2/3 majority in each chamber, it is sent to the states for ratification. Then 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment in their next general election by only a majority vote. If 3/4 of the states ratify the amendment, yet the remaining states do not, the amendment becomes law. Then the Constitution requires each state that did not ratify the amendment to place it on the ballot in the next general election, and continue to do so until the amendment is passed by a majority of the voters. 13th Amendment. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, officially ending the institution of slavery, is ratified. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. With these words, the single greatest change wrought by the Civil War was officially noted in the Constitution. The ratification came 8 months after the end of the war, but it represented the culmination of the struggle against slavery. When the war began, some in the North were against fighting what they saw as a crusade to end slavery. Although many Northern Democrats and conservative Republicans were opposed to slavery's expansion, they were ambivalent about outlawing the institution entirely. The war's escalation after the First Battle of Bull Run, Virginia, in July 1861, caused many to rethink the role that slavery played in creating the conflict. By 1862, Lincoln realized that it was folly to wage such a bloody war without plans to eliminate slavery. In September 1862, following the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in territory still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be declared forever free. The move was largely symbolic, as it only freed slaves in areas outside of Union control, but it changed the conflict from a war for the reunification of the states to a war whose objectives included the destruction of slavery. Lincoln believed that a constitutional amendment was necessary to ensure the end of slavery. In 1864, Congress debated several proposals. Some insisted on including provisions to prevent discrimination against blacks, but the Senate Judiciary Committee provided the eventual language. It borrowed from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, when slavery was banned from the area north of the Ohio River. The Senate passed the amendment in April 1864. A Republican victory in the 1864 presidential election would guarantee the success of the amendment. The Republican platform called for the utter and complete destruction of slavery, while the Democrats favored restoration of states' rights, which would include at least the possibility for the states to maintain slavery. Lincoln's overwhelming victory set in motion the events leading to ratification of the amendment. The House passed the measure in January 1865, and it was sent to the states for ratification. When Georgia ratified it on December 6, 1865, the institution of slavery officially ceased to exist in the United States. 14th Amendment. Following its ratification by the necessary 3/4 of U.S. states, the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing to African Americans citizenship and all its privileges, is officially adopted into the U.S. Constitution. 2 years after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts, where new state governments, based on universal manhood suffrage, were to be established. Thus began the period known as Radical Reconstruction, which saw the 14th Amendment, which had been passed by Congress in 1866, ratified in July 1868. The amendment resolved pre-Civil War questions of African American citizenship by stating that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. The amendment then reaffirmed the privileges and rights of all citizens, and granted all these citizens the equal protection of the laws. In the decades after its adoption, the Equal Protection Clause was cited by a number of African American activists who argued that racial segregation denied them the equal protection of the law. However, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that states could constitutionally provide segregated facilities for African Americans, so long as they were equal to those afforded white persons. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which announced federal toleration of the so-called separate but equal doctrine, was eventually used to justify segregating all public facilities, including railroad cars, restaurants, hospitals, and schools. However, colored facilities were never equal to their white counterparts, and African Americans suffered through decades of debilitating discrimination in the South and elsewhere. In 1954, Plessy v. Ferguson was finally struck down by the Supreme Court in its ruling in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, 15th Amendment. Following its ratification by the requisite 3/4 of the states, the 15th Amendment, granting African American men the right to vote, is formally adopted into the U.S. Constitution. Passed by Congress the year before, the amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." One day after it was adopted, Thomas Peterson Mundy of Perth Amboy, New Jersey, became the first African American to vote under the authority of the 15th Amendment. In 1867, the Republican-dominated Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act over President Andrew Johnson's veto, dividing the South into 5 military districts and outlining how new governments based on universal manhood suffrage were to be established. With the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, a politically mobilized African American community joined with white allies in the southern states to elect the Republican Party to power, which brought about radical changes across the South. By late 1870, all the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were controlled by the Republican Party, thanks to the support of African American voters. In the same year, Hiram Rhodes Revels, a Republican from Natchez, Mississippi, became the first African American ever to sit in Congress. Although African American Republicans never obtained political office in proportion to their overwhelming electoral majority, Revels and a dozen other African American men served in Congress during Reconstruction. More than 600 served in state legislatures, and much more held local offices. However, in the late 1870s, the Southern Republican Party vanished with the end of Reconstruction, and Southern state governments effectively nullified the 14th and 15th Amendments, stripping Southern African Americans of the right to vote. It would be nearly a century before the nation would again attempt to establish equal rights for African Americans in the South.